Now we turn to the deepest chamber, the transformation of unavoidable suffering into witness. Witness is what you become when you stand for a value under pressure and refuse to betray it. A witness does not merely speak. A witness embodies. The world argues. The witness lives an answer. In dark times, arguments multiply. Answers must be lived. What value will you witness to? Choose one you would want carved, not on a trophy, but on your heart. Perhaps it is truth. Perhaps it is mercy. Perhaps it is honor or humility or fidelity or joyful courage. Choose it and then make a pact with your future self. When pain intensifies, I will not abandon this value, but let this value accompany me through pain. This pact changes the atmosphere of your life. Suffering no longer merely happens to you. It happens around a chosen center. And a centered life moves differently through storms. You may wonder whether this makes you rigid. On the contrary, it makes you resilient. Rigidity snaps. Resilience bends without breaking because it is anchored. Anchors do not prevent waves. They prevent drift. When your value is chosen, your choices become clearer. The noise lessens. You stop auditioning for every role the world offers and commit to the role only you can play. The custodian of your conscience. But conscience needs companions, rituals, words, and community. Choose a daily ritual that remembers your value before the day asks you to forget it. Speak words that align your inner atmosphere with your intention. And find community, not a crowd, but a fellowship of those who also carry vows. In fellowship, pain is clarified. We are protected from the lie that our suffering is uniquely senseless. We discover that our particular grief participates in a universal music. Difficult and austere, yet capable of harmony when we listen for it. There is a discipline I commend to you. Instead of asking, why me? A question that can never be fully answered. Ask, to what purpose can I consecrate this? Consecrate is an old word. It means to set apart for a worthy use. Your pain, if left unattended, becomes bitterness or exhaustion. But if consecrated, it becomes fuel. Fuel for patience when you might snap. Fuel for understanding when others are careless. Fuel for protecting someone else from the wound that marked you. This is how wounds become wisdom, not by forgetting them, but by training them to serve love. You may think this too lofty for ordinary days, but most of life's meaning is not discovered in dramatic decisions. It is made in daily ones. In traffic, at the table, in the email you rewrite to make it truthful and kind. In the apology you offer without defending yourself, and the choice to hear rather than merely reply. Train in small arenas so that when the arena grows, your stance is already practiced. Character is a rehearsal that never ends. Let us also speak of joy. Joy is not the opposite of suffering. It is the companion willing to walk beside it. Pleasure is seasonal. Joy is vocational. Joy is what happens inside when you align your life with the good you have chosen. It does not erase grief. It does not erase grief. It does not silence lament. It harmonizes with it. When joy and suffering travel together, you become paradoxically light. Light enough to carry heavy things because you are no longer carrying them alone. Do not overlook beauty. Beauty is not a luxury for better seasons. It is a medicine for every season. Notice the ordinary splendor, the dignity of a face that has wept and still smiles. The humility of hands that work without applause. The sky doing its vast, indifferent mercy over your small but significant decisions. Let beauty tutor your attention toward wonder. Wonder is the friend of endurance. It keeps the soul from collapsing into cynicism. A cynical soul cannot be free because it cannot be surprised. Freedom requires the capacity to be surprised by goodness, even now. In time, you will meet moments when your chosen value costs you. Pay the price. The bill is addressed to your integrity. When you pay it, you gain what money cannot buy: self-respect, credibility with your own conscience, a night's sleep unbothered by the whispers of regret. You cannot control how the world will interpret your sacrifice, but you can control that you made it for love and not for pride. Pride spends suffering to purchase superiority. Love spends suffering to purchase someone else good. Choose love. It will not make you glamorous. It will make you free. Emerging from the shadows of captivity, the world presented itself with a clarity I had never known. Freed from the immediate threat of oppression, yet still carrying its scars, I confronted the astonishing weight of choice. Each day became a canvas upon which the mind and heart could exercise sovereignty previously constrained. I realized that survival had been only the prelude to living consciously, ethically, and with purpose. Freedom, once hidden behind walls of cruelty and deprivation, now stretched endlessly, waiting to be claimed through deliberate thought and action. The first steps into the external world felt alien. Streets, sunlight, the casual laughter of strangers, everything seemed both fragile and magnificent. The ordinary, I understood, carries a profound weight. The chance to act, to choose, to imbue life with meaning. Every mundane decision, the tone of a word, the direction of a gaze, the choice to offer kindness or patience, became a new battleground for freedom. The consciousness, trained in captivity, now recognized its capacity to shape the moral texture of the world around it. I began to observe that freedom is inseparable from responsibility. The absence of immediate threats does not diminish the ethical imperative. It magnifies it. Without the external pressure of survival, one is confronted with the pure, unadulterated question: how will I live? Will I cultivate attention, integrity, and compassion? Or will I allow inertia, distraction, and fear to dictate my actions? The lessons of suffering reveal that liberty carries with it an invitation and a duty. The duty to live deliberately, consciously, and morally. Memory, once a sanctuary from pain, became a lens for understanding. I reflected upon the faces of those who endured with courage, the small gestures of kindness that had sustained life in the camps, the moments in which moral choice had asserted itself against oppression. These recollections were not passive. They were active teachers. They illuminated the principles of dignity, ethical action, and attention to the inner life. The soul, I realized, must be continually cultivated, nourished by reflection, imagination, and the conscious practice of virtue. The external world, however, was not a return to innocence. Everywhere I looked, the scars of conflict, the persistence of cruelty, and the quiet surrender of many to despair revealed that the struggle for meaning continues beyond captivity. Freedom is not a state to be found. It is a discipline to be practiced. Every thought, every action, every choice of attention, every ethical decision is an assertion of autonomy in a world that constantly challenges it. The liberation of the body is only the beginning. The liberation of consciousness requires effort, reflection, and vigilance. I discovered anew the subtle power of ethical imagination. To envision a life lived with purpose, to rehearse moral acts, to anticipate challenges and respond with conscience. These were practices that sustained freedom. They transformed ordinary moments into opportunities for moral triumph. A conversation could become an act of ethical presence. A decision about work, family, or society could embody the lessons learned under deprivation. Life itself, once taken for granted, became an endless terrain for the exercise of attention, conscience, and moral creativity. Observation of human behavior outside the camps revealed patterns that had been invisible in captivity. Many who had survived extreme suffering continued to act as if the external world could be controlled or predicted. They clung to old resentments, to envy, to the illusions of status and fortune. Yet those who had truly learned the discipline of attention, moral responsibility, and conscious choice moved through the world with a serenity and power that no external force could unsettle. Freedom, I realized, is inseparable from the conscious exercise of thought, ethical engagement, and the cultivation of resilience. I also noticed the subtle ways in which suffering cultivates empathy. To have seen the depths of despair, to have witnessed the erosion of human dignity, is to perceive the world with an acute moral sensitivity. Every interaction, every act of care, every gesture of attention carries significance. The trivial is transformed into opportunity. To sustain life, to preserve dignity, to act ethically, to cultivate meaning. The liberated soul, trained in the crucible of suffering, understands the sacred weight of small acts. Reflection revealed another paradox. Freedom is often accompanied by uncertainty, anxiety, and the temptation of inaction. In captivity, decisions were dictated by necessity. Outside, the abundance of choice can paralyze. Yet, this very uncertainty is the opportunity for moral creativity. to navigate ambiguity consciously, to choose meaning deliberately, to act ethically despite doubt. This is the exercise of true freedom. It is here, in the absence of external coercion, that the soul discovers the full extent of its sovereignty. With each passing day, the world outside the camp revealed itself as both beautiful and treacherous. Freedom, once an abstract concept, now demanded active engagement. Every decision, every glance, every interaction became a canvas upon which the liberated consciousness could exercise moral and existential sovereignty. I learned that freedom is not merely the absence of oppression. It is the deliberate cultivation of thought, attention, and ethical action. To live freely is to inhabit responsibility fully, to act with conscience, and to shape existence with deliberate purpose. I began to understand the subtle architecture of the human soul, exposed and refined by suffering. The mind, once disciplined for survival, now had the capacity to envision life beyond mere endurance. Memory, reflection, and imagination intertwined to create a moral compass. The choices made in the moment, whether to speak truth, offer kindness, or preserve integrity, became acts of profound significance. The world, once oppressive, now presented an opportunity for ethical creativity, to transform ordinary existence into a deliberate exercise of meaning. Observation of others revealed enduring patterns. Many sought comfort in distraction, in the accumulation of possessions, or in social validation, attempting to fill the void left by suffering with superficialities. Yet those who had truly cultivated attention and moral consciousness approached life with a quiet strength, a stability impervious to circumstance. I realized that freedom is inseparable from moral and cognitive vigilance, the ability to perceive, judge, and act ethically, regardless of external conditions. In my daily interactions, I noticed the invisible threads that connect all human beings. Every gesture of compassion, every act of attentiveness, reverberates far beyond immediate perception. I recalled the small kindnesses shared in the camps, the covert exchanges, the whispered encouragements, the shared scraps of food, and recognized their enduring significance. These seemingly minor acts were, in truth, manifestations of freedom, deliberate moral choices that preserved dignity and asserted the sovereignty of the soul. The practice of attention became the foundation of conscious freedom. To observe one's thoughts without judgment, to discern the ethical weight of each impulse, to cultivate awareness of the moral dimension in every action. This was the work of liberation. Memory and imagination, disciplined and directed, created a moral and existential space where the self could flourish. Even in the absence of external threats, the inner life demanded careful stewardship, for it is here that true freedom resides. Encountering suffering in the world outside the camps reinforced these lessons. I saw the lingering shadows of trauma in those who had survived but failed to cultivate meaning, and in those who had lived superficially, untested by adversity. The contrast was stark. The disciplined consciousness, tempered by suffering, exercised freedom with integrity, compassion, and foresight. The unexamined consciousness drifted in distraction, fear, or moral compromise. It became evident that suffering, when met with reflection and ethical attention, is the catalyst for the deepest exercise of freedom. Ethical imagination, previously a tool for survival, now became a practice for flourishing. To envision a life guided by purpose, to rehearse acts of kindness and justice, to anticipate moral dilemmas, and respond with conscience. These practices expanded the domain of freedom. Ordinary moments became opportunities to assert autonomy. A conversation could embody patience and truth. A choice of work could reflect moral values. Even silence could be an act of ethical presence. The liberated consciousness recognizes that every micro-decision carries weight, shaping the moral fabric of life itself. In solitude, I confronted the paradoxical responsibility of freedom. Without the external constraints of oppression, every choice assumed immense significance. The absence of compulsion revealed the depth of ethical obligation. How will one inhabit this freedom? Will one cultivate attention, integrity, and compassion, or allow the self to drift into indifference, distraction, and moral negligence? The liberation of the body unveiled the greater challenge. The liberation of consciousness, the disciplined exercise of ethical sovereignty, and the deliberate construction of meaning. Empathy, honed by the crucible of suffering, became a guiding principle. To perceive the world through the lens of those still struggling, to act with care and attention, to preserve dignity even when confronted with cruelty or indifference. These practices affirmed freedom in action. Every human encounter, however fleeting, became an opportunity to extend moral presence. The discipline of conscious empathy, cultivated under extremity, proved to be the true measure of liberty. The world, once perceived as external and imposing, now became an intimate domain for moral cultivation. Freedom is not an abstract gift. It is a daily practice. It is exercised in thought, in reflection, in attention, in memory, and in ethical action. The mind, trained in adversity, recognizes that liberty is inseparable from responsibility, and that the full potential of life is realized only when every choice is deliberate, every action ethically grounded, and every moment attended with awareness. The world outside the camp was simultaneously familiar and alien. Each sunrise was a revelation, each gust of wind against my face a reminder of the simple freedoms I had once taken for granted. I walked along streets lined with people who moved with the casual rhythm of life, oblivious to the profound struggle that had shaped my consciousness. Their ordinary gestures, the way they greeted one another, the subtle choices in tone, posture, and attention, seemed imbued with layers of meaning I had never fully appreciated. In the shadow of suffering, I realized that life itself is an intricate moral theater, where each action, however small, carries profound significance. I observed the choices people made, sometimes in triviality, sometimes in crisis, and understood that freedom manifests in the deliberate exercise of attention and moral judgment. The liberation of the body is insufficient. The liberation of consciousness requires vigilance, reflection, and ethical engagement. A single word, an unconsidered glance, a neglected duty, each can ripple outward, shaping the moral landscape in ways both subtle and monumental. True freedom, I recognized, is inseparable from responsibility. It is the conscious decision to inhabit life ethically, to act with attention, and to create meaning where chaos and indifference might otherwise prevail. Every human encounter now became a laboratory of moral observation. I noticed how some individuals responded with compassion, patience, and generosity, while others operated under distraction, resentment, or fear. The patterns were instructive. Those who cultivated awareness, reflection, and ethical attention acted with integrity, even when unobserved, while those who surrendered to complacency or distraction were morally adrift. Freedom, I saw, is inseparable from conscious effort, and the lessons of suffering revealed the tools necessary to wield it effectively. Attention, reflection, empathy, imagination, and deliberate ethical choice. I began to study the subtle mechanisms of human thought. Memory, once a refuge in captivity, now became an instrument for constructing a meaningful existence. I would revisit past experiences with deliberate attention, analyzing the choices I had made, the ethical dilemmas I had confronted, and the moments when moral courage had preserved dignity against overwhelming odds. These reflections were not passive. They shaped the architecture of my consciousness, guiding action in the present and illuminating the moral dimensions of each decision. The inner life, I realized, is both sanctuary and battlefield. Its careful cultivation determines whether freedom is realized or squandered. Observation revealed the profound interplay between suffering and empathy. To have witnessed the depths of despair and the fragility of human dignity is to perceive the moral weight of existence with acute clarity. I understood that suffering is not merely an affliction to be endured. It is a lens through which one sees the world more fully, more ethically, and more consciously. The liberated consciousness is attuned to subtle moral nuances, able to recognize opportunities for care, intervention, and ethical action that might otherwise pass unnoticed. Every interaction, whether offering a smile, extending assistance, or simply listening attentively, became an exercise of sovereignty, a deliberate affirmation of life and dignity. Ethical imagination became a central practice. I visualized scenarios in which moral courage would be required, rehearsed responses to potential injustices, and anticipated the ethical challenges of everyday life. In doing so, I discovered a profound truth. Freedom is not merely reactive, responding to circumstance, but proactive, shaping reality through conscious attention and ethical creativity. Ordinary acts, a word spoken with care, a decision about work or relationships, even the choice to preserve composure in adversity, acquire monumental significance when understood as deliberate exercises of moral freedom. The paradox of post-captivity life became increasingly evident. Without the external pressures of survival, the mind must cultivate discipline consciously. In the camps, the exigencies of life imposed focus and ethical awareness. Outside, the abundance of freedom risks moral drift, distraction, and inaction. Every choice now carries weight. The freedom to act ethically, to pursue meaning, to cultivate attention, and to extend compassion, but also the responsibility to avoid moral negligence. Liberation is not granted by circumstance. It is claimed through deliberate cultivation of consciousness. Empathy, refined in the crucible of suffering, emerged as a guiding principle in navigating the external world. I observed subtle signs of distress, hesitation, and moral conflict in others, and learned to respond with ethical attentiveness. Compassion is not passive. It is an active engagement with the suffering and dignity of others, requiring the conscious exercise of moral judgment and attention. Each act of empathetic presence reverberates beyond immediate perception, shaping the moral universe in ways unseen but profoundly real. Memory and imagination converged as instruments of moral and existential navigation. I would reconstruct conversations, reimagine past ethical choices, and project future dilemmas with deliberate attention. This practice transformed ordinary moments into exercises of freedom. To observe a colleague, to respond with patience and integrity, to offer support or counsel, each becomes an assertion of ethical sovereignty. The mind, disciplined through reflection, memory, and imagination, becomes a bastion of freedom, capable of shaping the moral texture of existence even amid complexity and uncertainty. The liberation of consciousness also revealed the subtle dynamics of moral courage. Many who survived extreme suffering carried residual shadows of fear, bitterness, or resentment, and these shadows could subtly shape behavior, choices, and relationships. True freedom requires confronting these internal residues, cultivating awareness, and deliberately choosing ethical and meaningful responses. Freedom is not merely the absence of constraint. It is the mastery of the self, the disciplined exercise of conscience, and the capacity to act morally even when no one observes. Observation of society at large reinforced the importance of deliberate moral cultivation. Those who had experienced suffering but failed to internalize its lessons often sought comfort in distraction, material accumulation, or social validation. Their freedom was incomplete, for they had not yet grasped the sovereignty of consciousness. In contrast, those who had cultivated attention, reflection, empathy, and ethical imagination exercise freedom with quiet power, creating coherence and meaning in lives otherwise subject to uncertainty, loss, and the unpredictability of the human condition. I noticed the moral significance embedded in small decisions, a casual word spoken with attention, a deliberate act of care, a patient response to provocation, all become arenas for the exercise of freedom. The liberated mind perceives that each action, no matter how trivial it may seem, shapes the moral texture of existence. Life itself, in its smallest details, is an opportunity to practice ethical attention, to preserve dignity, and to cultivate meaning. These micro-moments, carefully attended to, accumulate into a life of profound moral significance. In solitude, I confronted the paradox of unbounded freedom. With the absence of external coercion comes immense responsibility. To shape life consciously, to act ethically, to cultivate attention and moral imagination. The abundance of choice can intimidate, but it also liberates. It invites the exercise of deliberate ethical judgment, the construction of meaning, and the extension of compassionate presence to others. Freedom, once hidden behind the walls of captivity, now demanded disciplined stewardship. Through these reflections, I discovered the enduring truth of human sovereignty. Freedom is inseparable from attention, ethical action, reflection, imagination, and responsibility. The capacity to act with conscience, to observe with awareness, to extend care, and to construct meaning defines the liberated self. Suffering, far from diminishing autonomy, prepares the soul to exercise it fully. The lessons of extremity, internalized and refined, illuminate the path to living consciously and morally in every subsequent moment of life. Stepping into the world beyond confinement, I felt the weight and the exhilaration of an unprecedented liberty. The body, once bound, now moved freely, yet it was the mind that demanded the deepest attention. Freedom, I realized, is never merely a condition imposed externally. It is a discipline, a daily exercise of conscience, reflection, and moral engagement. Each morning became a meditation in motion. What choices would I make today? And how would those choices affirm or diminish the freedom of myself and others? The act of walking down a street, conversing with a colleague, or responding to a challenge carried profound ethical implications, for every interaction is a test of attention, integrity, and moral imagination. Memory continued to serve as both guide and mirror. I reconstructed the faces of those I had encountered in the camps, recalling their acts of courage, subtle kindness, and moral resilience. Each recollection was an opportunity to study the principles of freedom in action. Small gestures of attention, a whisper of encouragement, a shared piece of bread, all had preserved dignity and asserted sovereignty of the soul under conditions designed to annihilate it. In post-captivity life, these memories became templates for ethical action, demonstrating that freedom is exercised not in grandiose acts, but in the meticulous cultivation of thought, attention, and moral presence. Ethical imagination became a daily practice. I envisioned scenarios where moral courage would be tested, conversations in which truth and integrity might clash with convenience, decisions in which compassion conflicted with fear, moments in which patience demanded a deliberate pause to preserve dignity. By rehearsing these moments, I trained the consciousness to act deliberately, ethically, and creatively. I realized that freedom is not reactive alone, it is proactive. To inhabit life fully, one must anticipate challenges, weigh consequences, and direct attention consciously toward moral engagement. I also observed the subtle dynamics of empathy in action. To witness suffering closely, to remember its forms and consequences, refines the capacity to perceive distress, hesitation, and moral ambiguity in others. Each act of empathetic attention, listening without judgment, offering support without expectation, observing quietly before intervening, became a moral exercise, a deliberate assertion of freedom in the ethical domain. The liberated consciousness recognizes that even small gestures ripple outward, shaping the moral fabric of the world in ways unseen yet enduring. The abundance of post-captivity life revealed the paradox of freedom. With the absence of coercion comes the immense responsibility to choose consciously. Many who survive suffering seek comfort in distraction, accumulation, or conformity. Yet these are illusions of autonomy, for true freedom resides in the deliberate exercise of thought, ethical action, and moral imagination. The liberated mind must cultivate attention continuously, observe itself and others carefully, and act with integrity regardless of external pressures. Freedom is not granted. It is claimed through discipline, reflection, and moral courage. Relationships became laboratories for exercising ethical presence. Each interaction presented opportunities to cultivate attention, empathy, and moral judgment. Conversations could be arenas for truth, patience, and understanding. Acts of care and compassion, offered freely, revealed the power of deliberate ethical choice. I observed that the ordinary, when engaged consciously, carries extraordinary significance. A glance, a word, a gesture of support, a decision to act patiently, all accumulate into a life of profound moral resonance. The liberation of consciousness also demanded confrontation with fear, doubt, and lingering shadows of trauma. The mind, once honed for survival under extreme adversity, now faced subtler but equally formidable challenges. The uncertainty of life, the fragility of human relationships, the temptation of moral complacency. To act with ethical clarity required ongoing reflection, attention, and the deliberate cultivation of resilience. Freedom is inseparable from responsibility, and moral courage becomes the daily practice through which sovereignty of the soul is preserved. I discovered anew the sacred significance of ordinary work, to engage fully, conscientiously, and ethically with tasks that might seem mundane is to exercise freedom in its most practical form. Each action, however small, becomes a moral choice, to act with attention, integrity, and diligence, or to allow distraction and negligence to guide behavior. The liberated consciousness perceives meaning in the routine, recognizing that ethical and deliberate attention transforms ordinary labor into a vehicle for freedom and moral presence. Observation of societal dynamics revealed persistent patterns. Some individuals, untested by extreme suffering, drift through life with distraction or resignation. Others, having internalized lessons of adversity, act with discernment, attention, and empathy. The contrast illuminated the nature of true freedom. It is inseparable from deliberate cultivation of consciousness, moral imagination, and ethical attention. To navigate the complexity of human life successfully requires vigilance, reflection, and the courage to act in alignment with one's deepest ethical convictions. I also explored the profound interplay between purpose and freedom. Every human seeks meaning, yet meaning is never delivered fully formed. It must be consciously constructed. The liberated consciousness recognizes opportunities to create significance in every sphere of life: relationships, work, community, and reflection. Suffering, far from destroying this capacity, refines it. Those who have confronted extremity possess a heightened awareness of moral responsibility, the ethical weight of choices, and the necessity of deliberate engagement with life. Freedom, therefore, is inseparable from the pursuit and realization of purpose. Solitude became both a challenge and a gift. Alone, the mind confronts the absence of external guidance, the temptation of indifference, and the weight of moral responsibility. Yet in disciplined solitude, the consciousness can exercise attention, refine ethical judgment, and cultivate imagination. Memory, reflection, and anticipation converge to form a domain where freedom is not theoretical, but practical. Every thought, every intention, and every ethical rehearsal strengthens sovereignty of the self. Freedom is thus a living practice, cultivated continuously through reflection, attention, and moral engagement. The paradox of abundance, in contrast to deprivation, is that freedom is easier to take for granted, yet harder to exercise consciously. In the camps, the limitations imposed by suffering focused attention and ethical awareness. Outside, with liberty restored, the mind must discipline itself deliberately. Each day offers innumerable choices, and each choice carries moral significance. To act without reflection is to squander freedom. To act with deliberate conscience is to assert sovereignty. In this light, the liberation of post-captivity life becomes a profound test. Will one inhabit freedom consciously, or drift passively through it? Ethical imagination continues to illuminate the path forward. By envisioning challenges, rehearsing moral responses, and anticipating the consequences of inaction or neglect, the consciousness extends its capacity to act freely. Each act of attention, compassion, and moral choice accumulates into a life that is both autonomous and meaningful. The ordinary, when approached with reflection and purpose, transforms into a sphere of profound ethical significance. The liberated mind perceives every interaction, every decision, and every fleeting moment as an opportunity to exercise sovereignty. In this new life, freed from immediate threat, yet still marked by the shadows of past suffering, I became acutely aware of the fragility and richness of existence. Every encounter, every decision, every fleeting moment presented the opportunity to exercise moral sovereignty. The lessons of captivity were clear. External freedom is insufficient without the deliberate cultivation of consciousness. To act ethically, to extend empathy, to preserve integrity in thought and deed, these became the new arenas of survival and triumph. The mind, once a battlefield for endurance, was now a laboratory for freedom. I observed the subtle currents of human interaction. Many move through the world with distraction or fear, failing to perceive the moral dimensions of ordinary moments. Others approach life with deliberate attention, exercising patience, discernment, and compassion. It became evident that freedom manifests not in the absence of constraint, but in the conscious exercise of ethical choice. To live freely is to inhabit responsibility fully, to cultivate reflection and imagination, and to act in alignment with one's deepest moral convictions. Memory, previously a refuge, became an instrument of moral and existential clarity. I revisited the small gestures of courage and kindness that had sustained life in captivity, whispered encouragements, shared scraps of food, subtle acts of solidarity that preserved dignity amid dehumanization. These recollections were no longer mere solace. They became blueprints for ethical action in the post-captivity world. I recognize that each choice, however minor, carries enduring significance, shaping the moral fabric of one's life and the lives of those around us. Empathy, sharpened by the extremity of suffering, became both a guiding principle and a moral obligation. To perceive the vulnerabilities, struggles, and silent suffering of others is to recognize one's capacity to intervene ethically. Each act of care, whether a word of encouragement, a gesture of patience, or a deliberate moment of listening, asserts freedom, preserves dignity, and reinforces the sovereignty of the soul. The liberated consciousness understands that morality is not abstract. It is enacted continuously through deliberate attention and ethical engagement. I explored the paradox of abundance versus deprivation. In the camps, survival imposed focus and clarity. Outside, with freedom restored, the mind could easily drift into complacency, distraction, or indulgence. The abundance of choice magnifies responsibility. How will one inhabit life consciously? Will one allow inertia, habit, or fear to dictate behavior, or will one exercise deliberate judgment, moral courage, and creative attention? The liberation of the body is only the beginning. The liberation of consciousness requires disciplined reflection, moral imagination, and vigilance. Ethical imagination became a central practice. I envisioned moments in which integrity would be tested. Conversations where truth and kindness might conflict with social convenience. Situations where compassion demanded courage. Instances in which patience and discretion would preserve dignity. By rehearsing these scenarios, I trained the mind to act proactively, not merely reactively. Freedom, I realized, is exercised not only in response to circumstance, but in the deliberate shaping of one's environment, relationships, and moral universe. Work, once a means of survival, became a canvas for ethical engagement. Each task, no matter how mundane, was an opportunity to act deliberately, with attention, integrity, and purpose. A single gesture of conscientious effort, a word spoken thoughtfully, a decision executed with care. These were acts of moral sovereignty. The liberated mind perceives the extraordinary in the ordinary, recognizing that every moment carries the potential to affirm freedom, integrity, and meaning. I studied the subtle interplay between purpose and freedom. Every human being seeks significance, yet meaning is never given. It must be consciously constructed. Suffering, paradoxically, sharpens this awareness. Those who have confronted extreme adversity recognize the moral weight of each choice, the ethical dimensions of every action, and the necessity of deliberate engagement with life. Freedom is inseparable from purpose. To inhabit life meaningfully is to exercise consciousness, ethical discernment, and imaginative foresight. Relationships became profound opportunities for moral cultivation. Each interaction between friends, colleagues, or strangers presented the chance to exercise attention, empathy, and ethical judgment. The ordinary exchanges of daily life, when approached with deliberate consciousness, acquire extraordinary significance. A word, a gesture, a patient listening, or an act of support can resonate far beyond the immediate moment, shaping the moral landscape in ways both subtle and enduring. The challenge of post-captivity life revealed itself in the confrontation with internal shadows. Fear, doubt, lingering trauma, and the temptation of moral complacency. To exercise freedom fully, one must confront these forces deliberately. Reflection, meditation, and rehearsal of ethical choices cultivate resilience, moral clarity, and attentiveness. The liberated consciousness learns to act in alignment with values, even when emotions, habits, or external pressures tempt deviation. Freedom, in its purest form, is the disciplined mastery of self in thought, action, and imagination. Solitude offered both challenge and opportunity. Alone, the mind faces the weight of responsibility and the vastness of ethical possibility. Yet in disciplined solitude, reflection, memory, and imagination converge to create a domain of moral and existential clarity. The consciousness can rehearse responses to potential dilemmas, observe its own biases and impulses, and cultivate patience, compassion, and deliberate attention. Each solitary moment becomes a crucible in which freedom is refined and sovereignty of the soul asserted. Observation of society illuminated enduring patterns. Some who have survived suffering fail to internalize its lessons, seeking comfort in distraction, social validation, or the illusions of external security. Others, having cultivated attention, moral imagination, and ethical vigilance, act with quiet power, shaping the world around them consciously and purposefully. The contrast underscores a profound truth. Freedom is not granted by circumstance but claimed through disciplined reflection, moral action, and continuous attention to the inner life. The smallest decisions emerged as profound arenas for freedom. Choosing to act with integrity in conversation, offering support in subtle ways, maintaining composure under provocation, or observing attentively before responding. These seemingly minor acts accumulate into a life of ethical significance. Freedom, exercised deliberately, transforms ordinary existence into a continuous practice of moral sovereignty. The liberated mind perceives that no action is trivial. Each carries weight and contributes to the construction of meaning. In the interplay between freedom, responsibility, and purpose, I discovered a guiding principle. The liberated self is always in motion, attentive, reflective, and engaged. To inhabit freedom fully is to recognize the moral implications of every thought, word, and deed. Life becomes an ongoing exercise in ethical attention, imaginative foresight, and deliberate choice. The ordinary becomes extraordinary through conscious engagement, and meaning emerges as a result of disciplined reflection, moral courage, and the continuous assertion of sovereignty over one's consciousness. In the quiet mornings, before the world had fully awakened, I often reflected on the nature of responsibility that accompanies freedom. The absence of immediate threat revealed the subtle pressures that now shape my life. Expectations of society, obligations to family and community. The silent demand that one's actions remain aligned with ethical conviction. Each choice, even the simplest, carried moral weight. The decision to speak honestly in difficult conversations, to honor commitments when inconvenient, to extend patience where impatience could easily dominate. Freedom is inseparable from this consciousness, for every act defines the moral landscape we inhabit. Work became more than a means of sustenance. It became a deliberate arena for the practice of ethical attention. I learned to perceive the inherent dignity in each task, regardless of its external significance. Preparing documents, teaching a student, engaging in a professional collaboration, each offered the opportunity to exercise careful attention, deliberate ethical choice, and conscientious presence. The liberated consciousness does not seek grandiose gestures alone. It recognizes that moral and existential sovereignty is exercised in the ordinary consistently, moment by moment. In social encounters, I noticed the intricate interplay of power, expectation, and vulnerability. Many unconsciously sought control or recognition, allowing fear or self-interest to guide action. Others, shaped by reflection and adversity, acted with subtle moral courage, offering attention, respect, and understanding even when unnoticed. Freedom, I realized, is cultivated not in isolation but in the engagement with others, in observing their needs, acknowledging their dignity, and exercising patience and discernment. Ethical action in relationships is the living proof of liberated consciousness. Suffering had revealed the depth of human resilience, yet life beyond adversity demanded new forms of courage. To confront uncertainty, ambiguity, and moral complexity without the immediate clarity of survival required continuous attention. Ethical judgment, reflection, and moral imagination became the instruments by which freedom could be preserved and exercised. I learned to anticipate situations where integrity would be challenged, to plan responses aligned with conscience, and to accept that mistakes and failures are part of the ongoing exercise of freedom. Each misstep became an opportunity to deepen reflection, to recalibrate moral attention, and to refine ethical discernment. Solitude offered the canvas for profound insight. In the absence of external demands, the mind confronted the infinite possibilities of moral choice. I would sit in quiet reflection, observing my own impulses, rehearsing ethical actions, and envisioning how my behavior could shape the lives of others positively. Solitude, once feared as emptiness, became a sanctuary where freedom could be exercised deliberately, without distraction or external coercion. The practice of attentive reflection in these moments strengthened the capacity to act consciously in the complex web of social, professional, and personal life. The reconstruction of daily routine demanded attention to the subtleties of moral and existential choice. Every interaction, from the casual exchange with a shopkeeper to mentoring a young colleague, became a microcosm for the exercise of sovereignty. Each moment offered opportunities to practice patience, empathy, integrity, and moral foresight. The liberated mind perceives that ordinary life, when approached with conscious attention, is a vast field for ethical cultivation. Freedom is enacted continuously in the accumulation of these deliberate, often invisible, choices. I began to explore the relationship between purpose and limitation. While suffering constrains, it also clarifies. Freedom without challenge risks superficiality, yet deliberate attention to constraint reveals pathways for growth and creativity. I encountered obstacles, personal, professional, societal, that tested patience, resilience, and ethical judgment. These challenges became opportunities to refine freedom, to assert moral sovereignty in concrete action, and to transform limitations into avenues for meaningful engagement. Constraint, when approached consciously, becomes a teacher of discipline, attention, and ethical foresight. Community became a new domain of reflection. I observed how social networks could amplify either ethical presence or moral complacency. To participate consciously meant to contribute positively, to observe attentively, and to act with moral and ethical intention. Small acts of generosity, thoughtful communication, and patient guidance were exercises in freedom, asserting presence, responsibility, and care. In contrast, indifference or negligence allowed freedom to be squandered, revealing the constant requirement for vigilance and ethical engagement. Memory and imagination worked in tandem to shape ethical action. By reconstructing past decisions, anticipating future dilemmas, and observing patterns of human behavior, the consciousness gained clarity in moral judgment. I learned to simulate interactions, weighing the consequences of honesty, empathy, and restraint, and rehearsing responses aligned with integrity. Each rehearsal strengthened the capacity to act decisively and ethically in unpredictable circumstances, reinforcing the sovereignty of the mind and the continuity of moral freedom. Freedom revealed its paradoxical nature. It is abundant yet fragile, exhilarating yet demanding. Without constraint, the temptation to drift into distraction or superficiality is constant. Yet, precisely because freedom is contingent upon deliberate attention, it acquires profound moral and existential significance. To inhabit liberty fully is to accept the weight of choice, to engage with complexity, and to act with integrity and foresight. The liberated consciousness does not passively exist. It continuously shapes its life and the world through deliberate ethical action. I discovered the transformative power of intentionality. Each choice, however minor, is an assertion of sovereignty. Choosing to respond with patience, to act with integrity, to offer attention, to preserve dignity. Intentionality transforms the mundane into an arena for ethical exercise. Life, approached consciously, becomes a series of deliberate acts that construct meaning. The liberated consciousness perceives that freedom is not granted, but cultivated, moment by moment, through disciplined reflection, attentive observation, and the deliberate exercise of moral imagination. Even in moments of joy, I remained attentive to the moral dimension of experience. Gratitude, celebration, and wonder became conscious practices, exercises in appreciating the value of life and the opportunity to act ethically. Freedom is not merely about responding to adversity. It is also about embracing the richness of life with awareness, integrity, and presence. Each smile, each expression of gratitude, each attentive observation of beauty reinforces the continuity of moral and existential sovereignty. Through continuous reflection, observation, and rehearsal, I came to understand that freedom is inseparable from engagement with life's complexity. Relationships, work, solitude, community, memory, and imagination are all domains in which sovereignty can be exercised. Every decision, every thought, every act of attention contributes to the construction of meaning and the assertion of ethical presence. The lessons of suffering, internalized and applied, guide the consciousness toward the deliberate cultivation of moral freedom, transforming ordinary life into a continuous exercise of sovereignty, integrity, and purpose. Leadership, I discovered, is not bestowed by position but forged through moral courage, ethical consistency, and deliberate attention. In professional and social contexts, I encountered situations requiring decisive judgment, often balancing competing obligations, desires, and consequences. To lead ethically is to recognize that every choice resonates beyond the immediate, shaping the moral and existential environment of others. True leadership exercises freedom not in the assertion of power but in the conscientious stewardship of influence, modeling integrity, responsibility, and attentive action. Rebuilding relationships demanded both patience and insight. The bonds tested and strained by years of suffering required conscious repair, ethical engagement, and imaginative empathy. Family, friends, and colleagues had evolved during my absence, each carrying experiences and expectations that demanded attention and moral flexibility. Freedom in these interactions required me to act deliberately, to listen attentively, to honor differences, to navigate conflict with compassion, and to extend ethical consideration to perspectives shaped by experiences distinct from my own. In the professional sphere, ethical challenges arose with subtlety. Decisions concerning collaboration, mentorship, and the distribution of responsibility carried consequences not only for immediate outcomes, but for the moral climate of entire communities. I observed how easily inattention, expedience, or fear could compromise integrity, and how deliberate ethical action reinforced trust, respect, and collective purpose. The liberated consciousness recognizes that every professional choice is a microcosm of freedom, a deliberate act of attention, moral imagination, and principled engagement. Purpose became a guiding axis for post-captivity life. Without the immediacy of survival, one must consciously construct meaning in work, relationships, and personal development. The challenge is both exhilarating and daunting. Each decision, each commitment, each act of attention contributes to the architecture of a meaningful life. Suffering, internalized, provides the clarity and discipline to navigate this terrain. It teaches that freedom is inseparable from responsibility, that meaning is inseparable from deliberate engagement, and that integrity is the foundation upon which authentic life is constructed. I reflected deeply on the concept of legacy, not in terms of accolades or recognition, but in the subtle, enduring influence one exerts through ethical action and conscious attention. Each interaction, each decision, each gesture of care or integrity shapes the moral and existential environment for those who follow. Freedom, I realized, is exercised most profoundly in how one impacts the lives of others through consistent ethical presence. To live consciously is to contribute to a continuum of meaning that extends beyond the self. Community engagement revealed further dimensions of ethical responsibility. Participation in social, educational, and cultural endeavors required continuous attention, patience, and moral imagination. I observed how even minor acts, mentoring a student, offering support to a colleague, contributing thoughtfully to discussion, resonate beyond the immediate, reinforcing the interconnectedness of human life. Ethical action, exercised consciously, propagates meaning and asserts freedom in ways both visible and subtle. The interplay of memory and anticipation became central to sustaining moral attention. By revisiting past choices, analyzing the consequences of actions taken or neglected, and projecting potential scenarios, I cultivated the capacity to act with foresight and integrity. Ethical imagination, disciplined through reflection, transforms ordinary moments into exercises of freedom. The liberated consciousness perceives that life is not a sequence of random events, but a structured opportunity for deliberate engagement with moral, social, and existential realities. Solitude continued to offer profound opportunities for reflection and refinement. In moments of quiet contemplation, I confronted the residue of trauma, the subtleties of fear, and the allure of indifference. Here, freedom is both tested and exercised. The ability to observe one's impulses, to deliberate ethically, to cultivate resilience, and to rehearse responses to moral dilemmas. Each solitary moment becomes a laboratory in which sovereignty of the mind is strengthened and the continuity of ethical attention is maintained. Even in joy, deliberate attention is required. Happiness, beauty, and celebration are not mere experiences, but opportunities to exercise consciousness, gratitude, and moral presence. To recognize the depth of life's value, to act with integrity in moments of pleasure, and to preserve dignity in the midst of abundance are acts of freedom as vital as those performed under duress. The liberated mind understands that ethical sovereignty and meaningful engagement are continuous practices, not contingent on external adversity alone. Every encounter now carried multiple layers of ethical significance. Conversations required careful listening, observation of nuance, and awareness of power dynamics. Decisions about collaboration, assistance, or intervention demanded foresight and empathy. I recognize that even brief interactions carry consequences far beyond immediate perception. Each moment, when approached with attentive reflection, contributes to the construction of a moral and meaningful life. Freedom is thus a continuous, deliberate practice exercised in thought, action, and the cultivation of relationships. Reflection on adversity illuminated the transformative potential of suffering. Challenges, obstacles, and setbacks in the post-captivity world were opportunities to apply lessons learned under extremity. To act with patience, integrity, and ethical courage in ordinary life is to affirm the sovereignty of the mind and the continuity of meaning. The liberated consciousness recognizes that suffering, when internalized constructively, equips the individual with the tools to navigate complexity, act decisively, and contribute positively to the lives of others. Work, relationships, solitude, community, and reflection became integrated practices for sustaining freedom. Ethical attention, imaginative rehearsal, empathetic engagement, and deliberate action form a continuum of sovereignty. Every act, no matter how small, reinforces the capacity to live intentionally, ethically, and meaningfully. The liberated mind perceives life itself as an arena for the continuous exercise of freedom, a canvas upon which every thought, word, and deed contributes to the construction of moral and existential significance. The synthesis of memory, reflection, and anticipation revealed the dynamic architecture of freedom. By examining past decisions, rehearsing responses to potential dilemmas, and engaging attentively with the present, the consciousness navigates complexity with clarity and purpose. Freedom is not static. It is an evolving practice, continuously refined through experience, reflection, and deliberate ethical engagement. Each day offers innumerable opportunities to act consciously, to cultivate attention, and to extend empathy, ultimately constructing a life of enduring meaning. As I navigated the post-captivity world, I confronted dilemmas that demanded nuanced ethical judgment. Decisions were rarely simple. They involved balancing competing values, anticipating unforeseen consequences, and responding with both courage and discernment. Choosing between helping one individual at the expense of another, advocating for justice while preserving peace, or intervening in conflict without imposing my own will. These situations became arenas in which freedom was exercised in its most subtle, profound forms. The liberated mind understands that ethical sovereignty is measured not only in grand acts, but in the precision, intention, and conscientiousness with which ordinary choices are made. Loss, though no longer immediate, lingered as a companion. Friends, family, and colleagues affected by time, distance, or mortality reminded me that life is fragile, and freedom carries the obligation to honor those who are absent. Mourning became an ethical practice, a conscious engagement with memory and legacy. By remembering with attentiveness and reflecting upon shared moments, I preserved their dignity, allowing their influence to guide my actions. Freedom, I realized, is inseparable from this continuous dialogue between the past and present, where memory shapes ethical attention and deliberate action informs the legacy we leave behind. In professional life, challenges revealed both the necessity and the difficulty of exercising ethical influence. Mentorship, collaboration, and leadership required continuous reflection, empathy, and foresight. I learned that ethical engagement in work is not a single act but an ongoing series of deliberate choices. To act with transparency, to honor commitments, to navigate power dynamics responsibly, and to cultivate integrity in all interactions. The liberated consciousness perceives that professional activity is inseparable from moral practice, and that each decision reverberates across the personal and social sphere. Purpose emerged as the axis around which freedom revolves. Life offers innumerable possibilities, Yet without deliberate direction, freedom risks fragmentation or superficiality. By aligning attention, action, and reflection with deeply held values, I discovered that purpose is not imposed but constructed, a continuous negotiation between aspiration, responsibility, and opportunity. Suffering, internalized, sharpened perception, and illuminated the ethical pathways that ordinary experience often conceals. Freedom is the capacity to inhabit these pathways deliberately with courage, clarity, and moral attentiveness. Community engagement provided another dimension for the exercise of freedom. Participating consciously in collective endeavors, educational, social, or cultural, demanded continuous vigilance and reflection. The smallest gestures, a word of encouragement, a patient response, a thoughtful contribution, resonated beyond immediate perception. Ethical attention, exercised consistently, reinforced communal integrity in the moral fabric of society. The liberated mind recognizes that every interaction offers a choice: to act with empathy and ethical presence, or to drift into neglect and indifference. The ongoing refinement of memory and imagination enabled the exercise of moral foresight. By revisiting past experiences, analyzing outcomes, and projecting potential scenarios, I trained my consciousness to anticipate challenges and respond ethically. Rehearsal of moral choices strengthens both awareness and decisiveness. Freedom, understood in this way, is not reactive but proactive, a deliberate shaping of the moral, social, and existential environment in which one lives. Every thought, word, and action becomes an opportunity to assert sovereignty and cultivate meaning. Solitude remained a crucible for reflection and refinement. Alone, one confronts both the residual shadows of trauma and the boundless possibilities of ethical action. By observing one's impulses, rehearsing ethical decisions, and cultivating attention, the mind strengthens its capacity to navigate complex circumstances with clarity and integrity. Solitude, approached consciously, becomes a sanctuary in which freedom is exercised continuously and sovereignty of the self is preserved. Even in joy, freedom demands attentiveness. Happiness, beauty, and celebration are opportunities for conscious engagement, to recognize value, to act with integrity, and to extend moral presence. Gratitude and wonder become ethical practices, reinforcing awareness of life's richness and the obligation to inhabit it responsibly. The liberated consciousness understands that moral and existential sovereignty is continuous, not contingent upon adversity, and that deliberate attention transforms ordinary experiences into enduring significance. Each human encounter carried layered ethical significance. Subtle observations, careful listening, and sensitivity to unspoken needs became tools for the exercise of freedom. Decisions to intervene, offer guidance, or extend patience required deliberation, foresight, and empathy. The mind trained by suffering perceives that even minor acts ripple outward, affecting the moral environment in ways that are often invisible yet profoundly real. Each day, each moment is a canvas upon which sovereignty, attention, and ethical imagination can be exercised. Reflection on adversity highlighted its transformative potential. Life's challenges, setbacks, and losses provide opportunities to refine ethical practice, strengthen moral courage, and cultivate attentive engagement. The liberated consciousness internalizes these lessons, applying them continuously in both ordinary and complex circumstances. Every choice, rehearsal, and reflection strengthens capacity for ethical action and meaning-making, reinforcing the continuity of freedom in thought, word, and deed. In work, relationships, community, and solitude, I recognize the seamless integration of reflection, memory, and anticipation as instruments of freedom. Each act, however small, contributes to constructing a meaningful, ethical existence. Deliberate attention, conscientious action, empathetic engagement, and imaginative rehearsal form the architecture of a life lived consciously. Freedom is enacted through the ongoing practice of sovereignty, integrity, and ethical presence, transforming ordinary experiences into arenas for moral cultivation and the realization of enduring purpose. Leadership, I discovered, extends beyond formal roles or titles. It is an exercise of ethical foresight and moral courage. In various spheres, professional, social, and communal, I encountered situations demanding decisions that balanced competing interests, often under conditions of ambiguity or incomplete information. The liberated consciousness navigates these moments with deliberate attention, weighing consequences, anticipating outcomes, and acting with integrity. Leadership is not the assertion of power, but the careful cultivation of influence aligned with ethical principles, the guidance of others without domination, and the preservation of dignity in every choice. Conflicts arose naturally, as human interests, desires, and fears intersect. Resolving these conflicts required patience, empathy, and moral imagination. I learned that listening deeply, acknowledging perspectives, and finding paths that honor both principles and human needs are central to ethical engagement. Freedom, I realized, manifests not only in the choices we make for ourselves, but in the ways we negotiate and mediate the freedom of others. Every intervention carries weight. Every resolution is an exercise in the deliberate application of moral sovereignty. Loss remained a persistent companion, reminding me of life's fragility. Friends, colleagues, and loved ones who were absent challenged me to preserve their memory ethically, integrating their influence into my actions and decisions. Mourning became a conscious practice, reflecting on the significance of their lives, acknowledging their contributions, and allowing their legacy to shape my ethical and existential compass. Freedom, in this sense, is inseparable from responsibility. We honor the past by acting with integrity in the present, and by shaping a future aligned with moral principles. Professional endeavors became laboratories for practicing ethical freedom. Mentorship, collaboration, and guidance demanded reflection and foresight. Each decision, from delegating responsibility to navigating organizational dynamics, required conscientious attention and ethical awareness. By cultivating deliberate action and integrity, I learned to transform work into an arena for moral and existential engagement. The liberated mind perceives every professional choice as an opportunity to assert freedom and to influence the collective ethically and responsibly. Purpose emerged as a central axis for post-captivity existence. Without the immediacy of survival, one must consciously construct meaning in work, relationships, and personal development. Alignment of actions with deeply held values became paramount. Suffering, once a crucible, clarified priorities and illuminated pathways toward meaningful engagement. Freedom is exercised most fully when guided by purpose. Deliberate choices, attentive reflection, and consistent ethical action coalesce to construct a life of significance, resilience, and moral sovereignty. Community engagement illuminated further dimensions of ethical freedom. Each interaction, whether in education, social projects, or informal networks, offered opportunities for ethical presence and moral influence. A word of encouragement, a patient dialogue, or a thoughtful contribution to collective decisions demonstrates the practical application of freedom. By acting with integrity and attention, one contributes not only to the immediate context, but to the moral climate of the broader community. Ethical action in ordinary interactions compounds into lasting impact. Memory and imagination reinforce the continuous exercise of moral freedom. By reconstructing past experiences, analyzing consequences, and envisioning potential scenarios, I trained consciousness to anticipate moral challenges and respond decisively. Rehearsing ethical decisions and weighing the outcomes of choices strengthened both awareness and agency. Freedom is not merely a reactive state. It is proactive, requiring foresight, conscientious action, and imaginative rehearsal to navigate complex realities effectively and ethically. Solitude offered both challenge and opportunity. In quiet reflection, the mind confronts internal shadows, fear, doubt, grief, but also explores the infinite possibilities of moral action. Observing impulses, rehearsing ethical decisions, and cultivating patience and resilience in solitude strengthen the capacity for deliberate engagement. Freedom is exercised continuously in these reflective moments, preserving sovereignty of thought and fostering ethical clarity. Solitude transforms into a laboratory for moral and existential development, reinforcing attentive consciousness and responsible action. Joy and celebration, when approached deliberately, became exercises in ethical and existential presence. Gratitude, wonder, and appreciation are not merely emotional states, but conscious practices that reinforce freedom and moral sovereignty. Recognizing the value of life, acting with integrity during moments of pleasure, And extending attention to the experiences of others ensures that ethical presence is maintained even in abundance. The liberated mind understands that meaningful engagement and moral agency are continuous practices, encompassing all dimensions of life. Every interaction carries layered ethical significance. Conversations, collaborations, and fleeting encounters demand attentive observation, empathetic listening, and principled action. Decisions regarding intervention, guidance, or support require foresight, sensitivity, and ethical discernment. Even the smallest acts, an encouraging word, a patient gesture, a decision to preserve dignity, reverberate, shaping the moral and existential environment. The practice of freedom is continuous, realized through disciplined reflection, intentional action, and attentive engagement with the world. Reflection on suffering's transformative potential revealed a profound truth. Adversity, internalized constructively, equips the consciousness to navigate complexity, exercise moral courage, and cultivate attentive engagement. Challenges in post-captivity life became opportunities to apply lessons learned under extremity. The exercise of ethical attention, even in ordinary circumstances, affirms freedom, strengthens resilience, and constructs enduring meaning. Each choice, rehearsal, and reflection fortifies the capacity for intentional, principled action. In work, relationships, community, and solitude, the integration of reflection, memory, and anticipation reinforced the practice of freedom. Each act, however minor, contributes to the architecture of a meaningful and ethical existence. Attentive action, empathetic engagement, imaginative rehearsal, and conscientious reflection form a continuum in which sovereignty, integrity, and purpose are exercised continuously. Life becomes a canvas upon which freedom is asserted, meaning is constructed, and ethical presence is cultivated. In the intricate web of community life, moral conflicts often emerge where interests, expectations, and needs intersect. Navigating these required careful observation, patient dialogue, and imaginative foresight. Some individuals acted impulsively, guided by fear or self-interest, while others hesitated, uncertain of the ethical course. The challenge was to intervene thoughtfully, balancing justice and compassion, asserting principles without domination, and fostering understanding without compromising integrity. Every resolution became an exercise in the conscious application of freedom, demonstrating that ethical attention extends beyond personal conduct into the broader social sphere. Reconciling with deep losses revealed the subtleties of grief and memory as instruments of moral growth. Friends, mentors, and colleagues lost through time, circumstance, or mortality demanded that I engage with memory ethically, honoring their presence by reflecting on their influence, integrating their lessons into my actions, and carrying their lessons into my actions. Legacy forward, mourning became a conscious, reflective practice, a dialogue between past and present, shaping decisions and ethical attention in ways that ensure freedom is exercised responsibly and meaning is constructed deliberately. Professional and social responsibilities intersected, providing arenas for ethical experimentation and reflection. Each mentorship encounter, project collaboration, and social initiative offered a field in which to practice patience, empathy, and foresight. I learned that freedom is most powerfully expressed when ethical attention guides every choice, no matter how small, and that influence is both a privilege and a responsibility. By observing the consequences of decisions, recalibrating responses, and extending consideration to all affected parties, the liberated consciousness cultivates both integrity and constructive impact. Purpose, crystallized through reflection on suffering, loss, and human limitation, became the guiding force for everyday action. The absence of immediate danger revealed the subtler demands of life. To act consistently with values, to cultivate moral clarity, and to integrate attention, imagination, and reflection into decisions. Freedom is not mere absence of constraint. It is the capacity to act intentionally, consciously shaping both one's inner life and the broader environment. Every decision, however small, contributes to the architecture of ethical and existential meaning. Memory and imagination operated in tandem to strengthen ethical foresight. I reviewed past interactions, analyzed outcomes, and projected potential scenarios, rehearsing responses to complex dilemmas. Ethical imagination became a tool for proactive engagement, allowing the mind to anticipate challenges and act decisively. Freedom, in this sense, is both reflective and anticipatory. It is exercised not only in reaction to circumstance, but in the deliberate shaping of moral and social realities. Each rehearsal of ethical action strengthens the capacity to navigate uncertainty with integrity and purpose. Solitude provided the laboratory for deeper reflection. In quiet moments, I confronted residual fears, doubts, and the shadows of trauma. Here, freedom was tested. The ability to observe one's impulses, reflect on ethical principles, and rehearse thoughtful responses. These moments refined attentiveness, patience, and moral discernment. Solitude, approached consciously, became a sanctuary for cultivating sovereignty of mind, deepening ethical awareness, and ensuring that choices in the social and professional realm were exercised deliberately and responsibly. Engagement with joy and beauty demanded equal attention. Gratitude, celebration, and wonder are not passive experiences, but exercises in deliberate presence. Acting with integrity while experiencing pleasure, extending consideration to others, and recognizing the value of life itself are acts of ethical freedom. The liberated consciousness perceives that moral and existential sovereignty is continuous. It encompasses moments of adversity and abundance alike, transforming ordinary experiences into profound opportunities for ethical and existential engagement. Each human interaction revealed subtle layers of ethical complexity. Conversations required careful listening, nuanced observation, and principled action. Decisions about when to intervene, offer guidance, or extend support required empathy, foresight, and deliberation. Even minor gestures, an encouraging word, patient listening, or protective action resonate beyond immediate perception, shaping the moral and existential environment. Freedom is exercised continuously in such moments, asserting sovereignty of thought, integrity, and attentiveness to the broader consequences of action. Reflection on suffering's transformative potential emphasized the importance of conscious internalization. Adversity, once understood and integrated, equips the consciousness with the tools necessary for ethical judgment, moral courage, and deliberate engagement. Daily challenges, even in ordinary life, became opportunities to apply these lessons, to act with patience, integrity, and ethical attention, thereby reinforcing freedom and constructing enduring meaning. Each reflection, decision, and action strengthens capacity for intentional living, ensuring that liberty is inseparable from responsibility. In work, relationships, and community engagement, the integration of memory, reflection, and anticipation created a dynamic framework for freedom. Every act, no matter how small, contributes to the construction of ethical and existential significance. Attentive action, empathetic engagement, conscientious reflection, and imaginative rehearsal form a continuous process by which sovereignty, integrity, and purpose are cultivated. Life becomes a canvas upon which deliberate, principled action asserts freedom and constructs enduring meaning. Extreme moral dilemmas confronted me with the raw complexity of human choice. In moments of crisis, when urgency and uncertainty converge, the simplest actions acquire monumental significance. Deciding whom to assist first, when to intervene, or how to respond without compromising principles demanded more than instinct. It required reflection, foresight, and moral courage. Each decision carried consequences that extended beyond the immediate, influencing both the ethical environment and the lives of those involved. The liberated consciousness, forged in the crucible of suffering, approaches such moments with careful attention, discerning both immediate needs and long-term ramifications. Losses of profound magnitude, friends, mentors, colleagues, and entire communities, required a reconciliation that transcended grief. The absence of those who shaped our lives cannot be filled, yet their influence persists in memory, ethical attention, and deliberate action. Mourning became an active practice of preserving dignity, integrating lessons and allowing legacy to inform present choices. Freedom is inseparable from this reconciliation. The ability to act meaningfully despite absence, to honor what has been lost through conscious, principled living, and to construct ethical pathways informed by memory and reflection. In exploring personal impact and legacy, I recognize that influence is measured not by recognition but by the sustained consequences of deliberate action. Every interaction, every mentorship, every ethical decision contributes to a continuum that extends beyond the individual. Leadership, guidance, and moral presence ripple outward, shaping social and ethical climates. Freedom is exercised in these moments through conscientious engagement, foresight, and ethical imagination. To act with integrity is to ensure that one's influence reinforces meaning, dignity, and moral coherence in the world. Existential reflection deepened as I considered freedom in its absolute form. Freedom is not merely the absence of external constraint. It is the conscious capacity to shape thought, action, and perception in alignment with ethical principles. With this freedom comes the supreme responsibility to exercise moral judgment deliberately, to navigate complexity with foresight, and to construct a life of integrity. Each choice, however minor, becomes a declaration of sovereignty and an affirmation of the ethical and existential potential inherent in human existence. Solitude offered the arena in which these reflections could crystallize. In isolation, the mind confronts both past trauma and future possibility. Ethical imagination, reinforced through reflection, enables the anticipation of dilemmas and the rehearsal of principled responses. Observing impulses, cultivating patience, and refining judgment in solitude strengthens the capacity to act decisively and ethically when confronted with complexity. Freedom thus exercised is continuous and self-reinforcing, rooted in deliberate attention and the conscious integration of experience. Engagement with joy, beauty, and gratitude became deliberate practices of ethical freedom. Experiencing pleasure responsibly, acknowledging the value of life, and extending ethical attention, even in moments of abundance, ensures that moral presence is sustained across all conditions. The liberated consciousness perceives that ethical and existential sovereignty is continuous. Adversity and abundance alike demand attentiveness, intentionality, and principled action. Ordinary experiences, approached consciously, become arenas for the exercise of freedom and the cultivation of enduring meaning. Interactions with others revealed the subtlety and depth of moral influence. Every conversation, gesture, or decision carries ramifications beyond the immediate moment. Choosing to respond with patience, empathy, and integrity, even when unnoticed, shapes the ethical environment in profound ways. Freedom is enacted in these ordinary yet consequential moments, reinforcing the continuity of moral presence and the construction of a meaningful life. The liberated mind perceives life itself as an arena in which ethical sovereignty is exercised continuously, moment by moment, action by action. Reflection on suffering and adversity highlighted its enduring transformative potential. Challenges and setbacks, internalized and integrated, equip the consciousness with the tools necessary for ethical discernment, moral courage, and deliberate engagement. Even in the absence of extreme danger, ordinary life provides opportunities to apply these lessons, to act with patience, integrity, and attentive reflection. Each choice strengthens capacity for intentional, principled action, ensuring that freedom and responsibility are inseparable in lived experience. Work, relationships, community engagement, and solitude became integrated practices for sustaining ethical freedom. Thought, attentive action, conscientious reflection, empathetic engagement, and imaginative rehearsal form a continuous process by which integrity, purpose, and sovereignty are cultivated. Every act, however small, contributes to the construction of a meaningful, ethical existence. Life itself becomes the canvas upon which freedom is exercised, meaning is constructed, and moral presence is continually reinforced. As I reflect upon the long journey from confinement to freedom, from survival to conscious living, I recognize that the essence of liberation is not merely the absence of chains, but the deliberate engagement with the moral, existential, and ethical dimensions of life. Freedom is an unyielding responsibility. It is the perpetual exercise of attention, the conscious shaping of choices, and the unwavering commitment to integrity in every circumstance. The scars of suffering are not mere reminders of pain. They are the instruments through which consciousness is refined, through which moral clarity is forged, and through which the depth of human resilience is revealed. Every encounter, every interaction, Every decision carries significance beyond its immediate appearance, the seemingly trivial moments. Sharing a word of encouragement, extending patience in a tense exchange. Choosing honesty over convenience, accumulate into the architecture of a meaningful life. Freedom manifests in these ordinary acts, as surely as it does in acts of extraordinary courage. To live consciously is to recognize that moral and existential sovereignty is not a static possession, but a dynamic practice, continuously exercised in thought, word, and deed. The weight of responsibility that accompanies freedom is immense. To act ethically with foresight and empathy requires constant vigilance, reflection, and moral imagination. Every choice is a declaration of identity, a statement of values, and a contribution to the ethical fabric of the world. In moments of doubt, when fear tempts retreat or indifference whispers seductively, the liberated mind recalls the lessons of suffering. That adversity clarifies, that constraint refines, and that deliberate action is the path to meaning. The consciousness shaped by suffering knows that liberty is inseparable from accountability, and that every act of attention preserves or diminishes the integrity of the life we construct. Reconciling with the irreversibility of loss deepens both humility and purpose. Friends, colleagues, and loved ones who no longer walk beside us remain present in the echoes of memory, in the moral imprint they have left upon our lives. Mourning becomes a practice of ethical remembrance, to honor absence through conscious living, to allow the lessons of those lost to guide action, and to weave their influence into the ongoing tapestry of choice and consequence. Freedom is exercised not only in presence but in the manner by which we preserve, integrate, and extend the legacy of those who shaped us. In professional and communal life, the deliberate exercise of freedom manifests in influence and responsibility. Mentorship, collaboration, and leadership are ethical laboratories in which the consciousness tests and refines its capacity for deliberate action. Every decision, every intervention, every act of guidance contributes to a continuum of moral influence. The liberated mind recognizes that legacy is not measured by accolades or recognition, but by the subtle, enduring impact of principled engagement with the world. To act consciously is to assert sovereignty, cultivate integrity, and extend ethical presence beyond the boundaries of immediate perception. Solitude, once feared as emptiness, emerges as the crucible in which freedom is strengthened. In quiet reflection, one confronts the impulses, doubts, and shadows that linger unseen. Ethical imagination rehearses responses to moral dilemmas. Attention cultivates patience, discernment, and foresight. Reflection aligns thought and action with integrity. Solitude is no longer an absence but a laboratory for sovereignty, a sanctuary in which the mind consolidates lessons from adversity, tests principles in contemplation, and prepares for decisive action in the world beyond. Joy, wonder, and gratitude become deliberate practices of freedom. Recognizing beauty, embracing moments of happiness, and acting ethically even in pleasure asserts moral and existential sovereignty. Abundance does not dilute responsibility, it magnifies it. Conscious living perceives that ethical engagement is continuous, that meaning is constructed through attention, and that each moment, whether shadowed by suffering or illuminated by joy, offers the opportunity to affirm integrity, cultivate empathy, and exercise deliberate freedom. Memory and anticipation converge to guide action. By reflecting on past experiences, assessing consequences, and rehearsing potential dilemmas, the liberated mind navigates complexity with moral clarity. Ethical foresight allows for decisive action that honors both principle and consequence. The consciousness shaped by suffering understands that freedom is active, dynamic, and continuous, a persistent engagement with the responsibilities of thought, action, and moral imagination. As the sun sets upon this chapter of reflection, a profound truth crystallizes. True freedom is inseparable from suffering, responsibility, and ethical vigilance. It is the conscious choice to engage with life's complexities, the deliberate cultivation of meaning, and the unwavering attention to moral integrity. Every act of courage, every gesture of empathy, every thoughtful decision becomes a brick in the edifice of a life well lived. The liberated consciousness perceives that meaning is not discovered passively. It is constructed actively, moment by moment, choice by choice, with awareness, courage, and attention. And in this awareness, I understand that the journey does not end here. The lessons forged through suffering, refined through reflection, and exercise through deliberate freedom prepare the consciousness for the next stage, a deeper confrontation with purpose, a more expansive engagement with meaning, and a continued with meaning. Assertion of sovereignty over thought, action, and life itself. The echoes of past adversity, the presence of ethical responsibility, and the imperative of conscious engagement converge to illuminate a path forward. A path where freedom, meaning, and moral integrity are not aspirations but lived reality, continuously enacted in the deliberate, attentive, and principled engagement with every moment of existence. The final revelation of this act is clear. Suffering is not a hindrance to freedom. It is its only authentic gateway. In the crucible of adversity, the consciousness is tested, refined, and liberated. In the deliberate exercise of ethical attention, in the reconciliation with loss, and in the creation of meaning through principled action, freedom is realized fully. To live consciously, to act intentionally, and to navigate the complexities of life with integrity is to claim the ultimate liberty. The liberty to construct a life of enduring significance, impact, and moral resonance. And so, with the lessons of the past deeply internalized, the consciousness stands ready, not merely to endure, but to act deliberately, to shape meaning consciously, and to carry forward a legacy of freedom tempered by suffering, strengthened by suffering. Reflection and realized through ethical, attentive, and principled engagement with the world. The journey continues as the mind, unchained yet profoundly responsible, steps forward into the horizon of life, prepared to exercise freedom in its fullest, most conscious, and most meaningful form.